Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of Emerging Revolutionary Wars Rev War Revelry. I'm your host this evening, Dan Welch. I'm joined by my colleague at ERW, friend, fellow Cleveland Browns supporter, Bert Dunkerly, and he's going to be joining us this evening for an interesting program in honor of National Women's History Month here in this coming month in March. So we're looking forward to that this evening. But before we get there, just want to let you all know that ERW is gearing up for the 250th anniversary of the shot heard around the world. Bert, myself, many other members of ERW, Mark Malloy, Rob Orson, Billy Griffith, Kevin Pollock, we're all going to be up there for the 250th anniversary, and we'll be bringing you a lot of live videos in real time at some of those locations and the numerous different activities and commemorations that'll be taking place up there. And boy, it's going to be here before we know it in just a matter of weeks. So we're looking forward to that. As always, please keep supporting us on the blog. We've got a lot of new great blog posts up by many of our historians at Emerging Revolutionary Wars blog, and more information continually coming out about our bus trip coming in 2025. So lots going on at Emerging Revolutionary War. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bert this evening. Bert's going to be talking about Revolutionary War women in the Southern campaigns during the American Revolutionary War. I've got one of those pictured in the Northern campaigns here behind me this evening, and I think a lot of our followers are very familiar with those women that joined the cause on the side of the colonists in the Northern campaigns, but maybe not as much in the Southern campaigns. So, Bert, what can you share with us this evening about those women in the South in the American Revolutionary War?
Thank you, Dan. And this is a really fun topic to get into for March and Women's History Month. I got interested in some of the stories I'm going to share when I worked at Kings Mountain and Moores Creek, which are both battlefields in the Carolinas. And there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about camp followers and women in general. But specifically with those sites and some other revolutionary sites in the Carolinas and in the South, there's a lot of myths that I wanted to dig into and see what I could learn about the truth, the reality of who these people were. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Bear with me here. All right, here we go. So first, I just want to say, I mean, this is obviously a huge topic. We're not going to cover, all women, all experiences here in the time we have. So that being said, tonight I want to focus on women who were camp followers with the armies and some civilian stories, but specifically in the Southern campaign. Um, when we think about women in the Revolution, I think we often have the ideas about, someone like Molly Pitcher that you mentioned, and there's a few other famous ones that come to mind. But it's important to remember that all of their experiences are different depending on, who they are, their class, their location, where they're living, what their status is. Um, we're talking about women in the North, in the Mid Atlantic, in the South, on the frontier. There are women coming over with the British military, the French, Germans, Native Americans, African Americans, different religious and ethnic groups. There's German and Irish settlers. There are Quakers, Moravians. There's just so much variety. So it's important to not just generalize too much, but think about the different experiences that these people have in the Revolution. I will, however, also point out that this is a time that can be pretty unforgiving for people who don't have a lot of means. So, there's no insurance, there's no Social Security, there's no sort of safety nets. So, for people who are working class, especially, an injury, an accident, a fire, a theft, anything like that can really set a family back, and maybe not be something that someone can overcome financially. Um, so it's important to remember that a lot of people are living life very much on the edge, and there's a lot of challenges day to day for people who were living 250 years ago. I want to just start out by saying there are some universal skills that almost all women had, regardless of class or social standing. One of them is spinning. Another is uh, cooking and food preservation, food preparation, gardening, and along with that, raising crops and animals, agriculture, animal husbandry, and sewing. These are universal skills that most women had, and they are going to use those skills for the ones who are joining with the military, the camp followers. I want to talk for just a minute about sources and how we know some of this information and the limitations of it. Uh, a lot of what we know comes secondhand or more, third hand, fourth hand. And a lot of the sources that we have been filtered over time. And it is difficult to get to the original accounts and original sources about these people. So what I have here, I'm showing you a pension application, which is one source that we have for veterans who could file pensions after the war, and wives could file pensions as well. But this particular pension is about Sarah Black, who was a washerwoman with the Maryland troops during the Southern Campaign. And if you look kind of in the lower right, not quite at the bottom, but you can see she's made her X, because most people were illiterate at this time. But this document talks about, very briefly, doesn't give a lot of detail, but it does verify her service as a camp follower with the Maryland troops. And this is another type of source that we have. This is a letter about the Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina. And I know it may be hard for people to read, but what this is talking about is a camp follower who was with the British commander Patrick Ferguson at Kings Mountain. And this letter was written by the descendant of a soldier who was there. And if you can make it out, you might be able to see in the upper part there in the middle, it talks about this woman being captured with the loyalist prisoners after the battle and taken along with the prisoners up into North Carolina. So secondhand source, but it's a pretty good one. And in the early 1800s, there was a huge interest in revolution as revolutionary veterans were passing away in large numbers. And so we start to see sources like this. A lot of our fans might be familiar with this, the Henson Lossing's Field Book of the Revolution sketchbook. He traveled, he interviewed people who lived near some of these historic sites and recorded stories. We have books like Kings Mountain and its Heroes, which used a lot of letters from family members who had soldiers at the battle. So people's fathers or grandfathers. A lot of firsthand stories in that. But these letters and all are collected decades later. The Sketches of the Life of General Nathaniel Greene, another similar type of book coming out in the early 1800s. And then this is something specifically about women. Elizabeth Elliot was a New York writer who collected stories about women in the Revolution But again, she's doing it in like the 30s, 40s, long after the war is over. But she is trying to collect original stories. But there's a long gap between when they happen and when she's collecting these things. So these are some of the sources we have, and we try to use them to piece things together. But there are gaps, and we have to be aware of biases and the changing perspectives, because people looked at the revolution very differently in the 1840s or 50s than they did in the 1790s, right after it was over. So women are going to be involved in almost actually all of the battles in the Southern campaign, big and small. And what I like to emphasize is that they're always there, but they're just invisible to us as historians because their stories are not always recorded and their presence isn't always recorded, but they are there with the armies and they're there in a lot of these small battles. So let's talk about camp followers, which is a term that a lot of people might be familiar with. Camp followers have a bad reputation, but they really shouldn't have that connotation. The British Army had a tradition of women serving with their armies. And when the Americans create their own continental army, they'll adopt a lot of the same traditions, and this will be one of them. So camp followers were officially part of the army. They had official duties. They had to, go through inspections. They had to be listed on the muster rolls. They got rations and pay at a different rate than a soldier. But I'll just read an example of some of the orders that the British are issuing with regards to camp followers. The non-commissioned officers to be answerable that no bad or disorderly women are brought into the barracks room by the men. So the women had to be of good character, as they would say, and for obvious reasons. And most of the time, these camp followers are the wives of soldiers or girlfriends. And the British are going to set a regulation. It was never standardized, but a certain ratio of how many women per regiment. And the Americans will adopt something similar to that. It varies in time and place, but they have these regulations in place. What these women are doing are, I call them odd jobs or camp chores. They are sewing, they're repairing uniforms, they're nursing the sick and wounded, they're collecting firewood. I've seen accounts of women rounding up cattle and other animals for the camps. The big one is laundry. Everybody loves laundry, right?
No.
Yeah, laundry was the big one that most camp followers are doing. What they are not doing, by and large, is cooking, because the soldiers were issued rations in a group called a mess, and the men were to cook their own rations. And I'm sure that there were times when women were helping with that, especially a soldier's wife. Excuse me, but that's not something that camp followers were there to do. They're doing things that support the army and help it function and keep operational. This is a time when armies don't have big support systems like our military does today. So you had to have people who could be dedicated to these sort of mundane things that help keep things running behind the scenes. And here's just some examples of women sewing in camp, repairing uniforms, laundry. That's the big one. See that all the time. Gathering firewood. Any kind of camp chores that would free up soldiers to do soldiering. And yes, where there's women, there's often children. And we have a lot of information about children being with the American and British armies on campaigns. Generally, when the armies are in a garrison, like they're camped somewhere or they're stationed in a city or a fort for a long time, you have a larger population of women and children. when the armies are out in the field actively campaigning, they will leave a lot of them behind, but they'll only take a small number to be out in the field. It's a logistics challenge, feeding and protecting everybody. And I'll just run through some examples from some of the more famous sites that people might be familiar with. This is the Brandywine battlefield in Pennsylvania, and we have accounts of women who were with the American Army refilling canteens during the battle. It was a hot day. That was an important service that they could do behind the scenes. This is Valley Forge. We know that there were a lot of women with the Army at Valley Forge. And that's something to also remember, is that the women experience everything that the soldiers do. If it's cold, they're cold. If they're low on food, they're low on food too. They suffer everything that the soldiers suffer, all of those experiences. And going along with that, I mentioned that the women get pay and rations. They're subject to military discipline, and I'll talk about some examples later. But women can be punished just like a soldier can. They have to obey orders just like a soldier does. Let's move to the South, which is where a lot of my research really focused. This is the Camden battlefield in central South Carolina, and we have accounts of women who were with the Continental Army under General Gates, who were here at Camden. This is going to be a disaster for the Americans. The Army is routed. They retreat, confusion. And we have information about women being at the rear of the Army with the wagons. And when the retreat starts, they get caught up. They get swept up in this confused, chaotic retreat. And there's accounts of women being thrown out of wagons as these wagons, hit stumps or rocks in the roads. And of course, they're terrified, just like the soldiers are. They don't want to be captured by the enemy. Kings Mountain in South Carolina as well. This was a really unique battle fought between American forces on both sides, American revolutionaries and loyalists. The commander of the loyalists was the only British person there, Major Patrick Ferguson. He will be killed in the battle. That's his grave right there. There are a lot of accounts, eyewitness accounts, that talk about Ferguson having two women with him, camp followers. And one of them was captured at the end of the battle. I showed you that letter earlier. One of them was killed. As the battle ends, it's very chaotic. We know prisoners were being shot. It was hard to get the shooting to stop as the battle ends. So the tradition has always been that Ferguson was buried under this rock pile along with Virginia Sal, who was the camp follower who was killed. And a couple of years ago, many years ago when I worked there, the park did some archaeology, ground penetrating radar. And I don't know enough of the science to decipher everything here, but what we did determine, and what you can see here on the screen, is that there are two burials under that rock pile. So there you go. That was pretty exciting. Another battle that some of our listeners might know about is Cowpens in South Carolina, fought in January of 1781. And there were several women who were involved peripherally in this battle. One of them was Kate Moore Berry, 29 years old. Her husband was in the militia. They lived in the area here. And when the word went out that the militia was going to gather at the Cowpens, which was a local landmark, she is going to, her husband's already out, but she is going to help spread the word. And what she does is she has an infant daughter that she ties to the bed, and leaves the house and rides around all night helping spread the word and gather the militia. After the battle is over, the British are driven from the field. It's a total defeat. The British commander is Bannister Tarleton. He's a very hated British commander. He and the remnants of his force are retreating down the road. They come to a house owned by the Gaudeloc family. The British will take the husband and use him as a guide, Adam Gaudeloc. They take him prisoner and they force him to guide them away. A couple minutes later, American cavalry shows up, Light Horse Harry Lee, and they go up to the Gaudeloc house and they ask Mrs. Gaudeloc, we don't even have her name, which is often the case with these stories, which way did they go? And she points them down the other way because she was afraid that if the Americans caught up to the British, they would get into a skirmish and her husband might get shot. So she sent the Americans down the wrong road on purpose, and maybe by her actions allowed Tarleton to escape. He does escape, but we'll never know what might have happened if Lee and his cavalry had gone down the right road. But just some interesting examples, not on the battlefield of Cowpens, but before and afterwards. This is a really great story that people in the Carolinas might be familiar with. The house here is called the House in the Horseshoe. It's at a bend in the river. This is in south central North Carolina. And the home was the home of the Alston family, Philip Alston and Temperance. Philip is a militia commander. In the summer of 1781, he's out in the field with his troops, and a local loyalist force comes up to the house and wants to know where he is. Sorry, remember the details wrong. He had come back to the house along with some of his soldiers. And it's important to remember that the war here in the Carolinas by 1780, 1781 is very much a civil war. It's very brutal between small groups, people that are neighbors, might even know each other, might have been friends at one point. Well, the Loyalists are under the command here of David Fanning, and they surround the house, and a few of the American militia are in the house, and they start shooting. And this sort of standoff goes on for a while, neither side getting an upper hand. But then the Americans look out the window and they see a wagon being loaded with hay and set on fire. Now it's going to get serious. So, with bullets flying, Temperance will open the door, step out onto the porch, and call out to Fanning and ask to speak with him. And she negotiates a surrender in which the American militia are allowed to leave. The Loyalists do not burn the house down. That's why the house is still there. It's the original house. But that's a great story, too. And that's a historic site you can visit today, House in the Horseshoe. Something that I think is also important to remember with all of these people is as they're moving around with the armies, the Carolinas are pretty sparsely populated, especially in the backcountry areas, the western areas. We're talking long, lonely miles of marching, very few towns, not a lot of resources in terms of food and water and shelter. And just imagine the drudgery of marching day after day through these woods, whether it's in the heat or in the cold. We often think about the soldiers doing that, but these camp followers and sometimes civilians are caught up in this too. There are two monuments for women in the Revolution in North Carolina. I want to just talk about both of them. What you're seeing here is Moores Creek battlefield near Wilmington. This was fought at the very beginning of the Revolution. And the monument there honors the women of the Lower Cape Fear who supported the Revolution. And in front of it, you can see two graves. They are for Polly Slocum and her husband. According to local legend, he was in the battle, was wounded. She had a dream and rode for 70 miles to find him on the battlefield and nurse him back to health. And later on, after the Revolution, their graves were moved to the battlefield and the monument was put up. Probably not the case. For various reasons, their ages and his service records, none of that information really jives with what we know about Moores Creek. But it is a great monument, and it tells the story of these women in the Lower Cape Fear who were very active in and around Wilmington. And so it does help draw attention to their story. And then we have another monument at Guilford Courthouse, which was another largest battlefield of the Revolution in North Carolina. And this is for a woman named Karen Hepich, who came to the battlefield to nurse a wounded son. And again, this helps draw attention to the roles of women and different ways that they participated in the Revolution. I just want to talk a little bit more about camp followers with the American and the British Army. We have some great information about what they're experiencing, especially with the British in 1781 in North Carolina at about the time of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The British Army was very low on supplies, moving around the countryside, foraging, and plundering was a problem, and not just for the soldiers. So Cornwallis is going to issue this order. The officers commanding companies cause an immediate inspection of the articles of clothing at present in possession of the women in their companies, and an exact account taken thereof by the pay sergeants, after which their necessaries are to be examined at proper opportunities, and every article found in addition thereto burned at the head of the company. So they're going to be doing more regular inspections. If they find extra things that don't belong to them, they're going to be destroyed. Another order talks about, it says, punish all men and women so offending with the utmost severity, meaning plunder. And lastly, frequent roll calls will be implemented to discourage straggling and looting. Women are to attend all roll calls, except such that are in the service of officers, and everyone found absent to immediately be whipped and drummed out of the brigade. So, I talked earlier about Army discipline. These are desperate times, and, again, living off the land, sleeping on the ground, sleeping outside, exposed to the weather, moving around with the armies. They're experiencing all those things. Sometimes we get little tidbits of information, and it's so frustrating as a historian because we just wish we knew more. We wish they gave us more detail. And I'll give an example of that. In 1781, as the American Army is approaching Charleston, which is in British hands, the American Army under General Nathaniel Greene is camped outside the city, looking for an opportunity to retake Charleston. The American Army had not been paid well, low on supplies, and there's a lot of unhappiness in the ranks. And, there had been mutinies before. There had been several mutinies among different troops. in the Army before this. Well, General Greene's writings talk about a mutiny that was discovered by a woman named Becky. Her husband was a Maryland officer, and she reported it, and it got passed up the chain of command, and they were eventually able to find the ringleaders, and they were punished. One was executed, and Greene writes in his papers about Becky providing this information, doesn't give her last name. We don't know who she is. We don't know whose wife she was. It's so typical of the things that we're dealing with. And I mentioned before the experiences of women in different places, different ethnicities, religions, and races. As the armies move across the South, lots of runaway slaves are going to join the British, who offer freedom to runaway slaves. The British want men who can be laborers and guides and do physical work, but they will get everybody. They'll get men, women, and children. And for those people, the decision to run away or stay put and maybe wait for another opportunity and freedom is absolutely a difficult one and one of life and death. But these women experienced the revolution in very different ways. And those who do make it to the British and do evacuate with them at the end of the war will be resettled in Nova Scotia. Imagine the culture shock of going from low country South Carolina to the cold of Canada, Eastern Canada. And of course, many are recaptured and retaken back into slavery at the end of the war. Closing this up, I want to mention Yorktown. This is the last major battle of the Revolution. And we have a great account of a camp follower who's with the American Army here. And she talks about being in the trenches, like this right here. And she actually ran into George Washington on one of his inspections as he's moving down the line. And he asked her about, aren't you worried about this incoming artillery fire? And she basically says, well, the men have to be here, and I'm helping them, bringing food up to the men on the front lines. It's an amazing story. And there she is, Sarah Osborne. We actually have a photograph of her. She lived long enough to have her picture taken after the war. I think this is the only woman or camp follower that we have a photo of. There aren't many photos of Revolutionary War veterans. And she looks very much like a grandma here, but imagine when she was a young woman in her 30s, traveling with the Army, seeing lots of battles. Her husband was a soldier, and you're looking at someone who looked at George Washington. I think that's pretty cool. I think that's it for my photos. So I'll just wrap up with a couple more thoughts. Some amazing stories. And like I said, it's just so frustrating at times because we wish they would have told us more. Often we have reports by officers who just mention the women in passing, like, oh yeah, there's horses, there's wagons, there's women, And I think in a lot of ways, it's a lost opportunity because a lot of these women live, after the Revolution. They died in the 1790s, early 1800s. They could have been interviewed. They were local celebrities. People knew what they did. Some of these women I talked about, there are local stories about them, but no one sat down and interviewed them like we would today. We have that one photo, but no one made sketches for the most part of these people or photographed them. So much is lost. Just kind of makes me regret that we couldn't learn more about them. But Dan, if you have some questions or things you want to discuss with this, let's do it.
Yeah, I think you tied things up quite well there at the end and set up a great transition to one of the thoughts I had. You're obviously a book guy. We can see a portion of your at-home library behind you. I'm a book guy. Also, enjoy the hunt for books and reading books and collecting books. One of the things that I've noticed in Revolutionary War historiography is that really the role of women as it tied to military campaigns and battles has only really recently, within the last 10, 15 years, become a topic of academic study, or we're starting to see books come out on these heroines. I think a majority of us are familiar with many of the books, that focused on Abigail Adams or some of those more other famous women that were associated with some of the big shakers, movers and shakers in the Revolutionary War era. But why do you think there's been such a dearth on having these stories collected or told in book form, not only immediately after the war, but throughout the 19th century and now all the way into the 21st century?
I think there's a couple things. One is that there are the famous people. You mentioned Abigail Adams, and we have Molly Pitcher, and there's Deborah Sampson. A lot of people have heard of her. She disguised herself as a soldier, fought in a couple battles before she was wounded and discovered. But there hasn't been much research into the sort of the everyday, the common people, kind of like the equivalent of the common soldier, like I'm talking about here. A big challenge is sources. There are records; they take a lot of effort to find, and it's tedious. And a lot of times, there's just not much information. Like some of the sources I shared at the beginning, they mention somebody. We often don't even have last names.
Mm.
So I think it's the lack of sources, but more could be done. I think more could be done. There's a lot of information in records relating to after the war pension and loss claims for the British and the Americans. Those things can be looked at in more detail, but it's just a lot of records are not easily accessible.
Yeah, and I was surprised that even some of the more famous names associated with women's roles in the American Revolutionary War, particularly on the battlefield or in theater in these campaigns, have been neglected to be told. I can remember my first trip with fellow ERW member Rob Orson down to South Carolina, hitting some of those battlefields,
You
and
couldn't find anyone better to go with.
I couldn't find anybody else to go with. He was the only one free that weekend. But you know, I had done some prep work before we went down there, did some research, did some secondary source reading, and Andrew Jackson's mother in the thick of things at Waxhaws, and going to see the monument to her and her grave site. But even that even though she's related to the future president of the United States and military luminary in our history, even that's a story that's not as widely known, say, as a Molly Pitcher or an Abigail Adams. So I completely agree with you that although we're starting to see some of that come out more recent scholarship, that there is plenty of room left in that field. And based upon your presentation tonight, we know that a lot of what occurred on the battlefield, in camp, and on campaign was facilitated by the roles of women. And clearly, there's a lot more room to fill out those stories of their participation in the war effort. Now, one of the questions I did have for you, and I think a lot of our listeners are going to have this same question, is obviously, colonists that are fighting up, signing up and going off to fight. in the Continental Army or some of the colonial militia have that home field advantage. Their wives, their families are already with them, and same for the loyalists. But what do we see as far as camp followers or wives or family coming with British soldiers to North America? Anything that you can kind of share with us on that front?
I didn't look at any individual specifically. Um, I I did find, like I shared, those British the orders about enforcing discipline. I guess just thinking about it, it must have been a pretty bewildering experience to be, you know, obviously so far from home and in such a foreign place. Cornwallis has like 2,000 men who's marching around the middle of North Carolina. There's maybe less than 100 women with them. Imagine that sense of isolation must have really been weighing on them. But again, their experiences are different everywhere because there's women with the British garrison in New York. There's women with the British Army that invades down from Canada and goes to Saratoga. There's the garrison in Florida, St. Augustine. So every place is different.
I got just one more question for you tonight, Bert. And again, I think this might be something that some of our listeners would be interested in as well. Clearly as Washington takes command, and we start to see the formulation of a true American army. A lot of the policies, the regulations of this army that are being formed are based upon the British Army of the time. Do you have any sense that the role of women or their inclusion or allowed to be, with these armies in the field? Do you have any sense that that was something that was discussed at Army headquarters, the formation of the American Army, in Congress? That this was perhaps a decision or a cognizant decision to include women in these roles with the Army?
It's not something that the uh, American leadership discussed at like the congressional level or anything like that. Um, Washington and a lot of the generals were very well aware of the British tradition having women in the military. Um, Washington didn't like it. He thought it made the army look unprofessional,
Mm-hmm.
and he thought women were in the way. They were riding on wagons when the army marched. They consumed supplies, but and Greene felt the same way. A lot of the commanders weren't crazy about it, but I think that they reluctantly let it go because they knew that you had to have that support system. All those odd jobs in camp are being done to support the army and keep it functioning. And a lot of these are soldiers' wives. You send them home, you're less likely to have the men staying. That's going to be an issue. So yeah, I think that they reluctantly put up with it, and they created policy as they went. There was never a national policy. Things were sort of done in different places based on the local situations.
Boy, I would have loved to have seen George tell Martha in person that women were getting in the way.
Well, he knew better than to probably say that to his wife.
That's that's right. Well, Bert, I just want to thank you for this presentation this evening in honor and celebration of Women's History Month during the month of March, kind of expanding the story of women during the American Revolution and particularly in the South, which I think we could both agree, and many of in our audience would agree that those Southern campaigns just don't get them as enough attention and love as the Northern campaigns do. So thank you again, Bert, for your presentation this evening. And thank you for all of you for joining us tonight and taking part in this installment of Emerging Revolutionary Wars Rev War Revelry. We hope to see you again here in 2 weeks. And for all the latest ERW news and history, make sure you check out not only our social media pages, but also our blog and the back issues, if you will, back recordings of our podcast Until next time, I'm Dan Welch, and this is Bert Dunkerly, and thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.